Order, and welcome to this session of the subcommittee of the Liaison Committee that's looking at how select committees can scrutinise and encourage strategic thinking in government. If I may, we will just kick off with brief introductions from each of you. Who you are? Introduce yourselves.
I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and a former Senior Civil Servant.
I'm Alex Thomas, Programme Director at the Institute for Government, leading our work on the civil service, and a former Senior Civil Servant.
Matthew Flinders, Professor of Politics at the University of Sheffield.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Well, I will kick off with the first question. What exactly is strategic thinking in government?
I think strategic thinking is all about how do you design effective and integrated policy with the emphasis on integration. I think strategic thinking, strategic capacity has three elements, one of which is often overlooked. The first element is a long-term, mid-long-term dimension. Second is a horizontal, cross-governmental dimension. And the third dimension that's often overlooked is a historical dimension of learning from the past. One of the biggest challenges we face is a lack of institutional memory. So for me, strategic capacity is about being able to reach across those three dimensions with clarity.
Very good.
And for me, I agree with that. For me, it's a plan of action to achieve a defined set of objectives. So I'd pick out five things. Firstly, determining the objectives and the priorities in which they sit. Secondly, allocating resources. Thirdly, organising institutions and structures in order to implement those objectives. Fourthly, the implementation of policy, and then fifthly, evaluation.
So I don't have very much to add. I would also go with, your starting point is what are you trying to achieve. I think a really important part of it is really understanding the context, a bit of what Matt was saying about the sort of how did we get here, about the history as well, because I think quite often you go wrong when you set objectives but don't understand your current situation well enough, because then what you're trying to do is actually align your policy, resources, capability, inside and outside government to achieve those objectives. And I think you need also to think about the risks and think about linkages and interdependencies with other areas that you're doing things. And then I think the other thing that it really does require, Alex mentioned evaluation, is regular reiteration, not changing those objectives necessarily. You might want to update them, but actually thinking, we're trying to achieve this. Are we making the progress we expected? Are things happening? Are there other issues we need to be dealing, some unintended consequences or whatever? And so you regularly update it as well, because it should be a sort of, if you like, a lodestar for what you're trying to achieve.
We gave you some thoughts on paper about the answer to that first question. How does our wording align with your own thinking?
I think for my part, the content is very close. I'd pick out, coherence over time of reality, as Jill was saying, policy, activity, and resource. I think, there were two points that I would add to it, or two comments that I'd make on it. One is that point about evaluation and kind of the iteration of the activity being embedded in it. And secondly, the sort of, the former practitioner in me would say the definition you provided has, it's got quite a lot of brackets in it. It's a bit long. I think something punchier that maybe talks about a plan of action would be a good starting point before getting into the detail.
Mr. Flinders.
I thought it was very interesting. I again had some concerns. It seemed rather a technocratic definition. For me, strategic capacity is very simple. It's about emphasising and developing connective, catalysing and collaborative capacity. It's also more simple than that. It's about what are the story we're telling. There's a big link between strategy and story. What's the story we want to tell about where we're going, why, and how we're going to get there?
Anything to add, Jill Rutter?
No, I think as long as successful implementation means, are we actually delivering our objectives? Because you can implement your policy quite successfully at one level, but it might not necessarily actually change things on the ground. So you can cut income tax, but do you grow the economy if that's why you thought you were cutting income tax? I think it's a sort of interesting question about how far that goes.
How should government understand the difference between policy and strategy and plans?
I think it's quite simple. And actually, I think sometimes strategy is doing nothing, and we forget that. But I think if you think about the classic policy cycle that we teach a lot of students about, strategy is the high-level ambition. under which lies policies, under which lies implementation. Now, there's obviously an interrelationship between them, but there's a layered dimension that strategy is about the high-level ambition of where we want to get to, how we define the problem, and why we want to get there. And really, the strategy is the anchorage point from which everything else should flow.
Yeah, and
policy becomes after strategy.
I think so. Although I'd emphasise Matt's point about you're doing a strategy whether you know it or not, and the question is whether you're doing an active, thought-through strategy in order to achieve something, or you're just kind of blowing with the wind.
And Professor Flinders, what do you mean by strategic scrutiny?
Well, I think what's interesting in the past, and forgive me, I've been through this debate about how to build and sustain strategic capacity for the last 30 years, is that often we see this as an issue for the government. And actually, I think in many ways, strategic capacity is too important to leave to the government, and there's a great role for select committees to define new forms of supportive scrutiny to help the government think about strategic goals through new ways of engagement and new ways of partnership. So for me, strategic scrutiny is a complement to building strategic capacity. What we lack is strategic scaffolding to support ministers and officials. And select committees could and arguably should play a stronger role as part of that positive strategic scaffolding.
I'm just thinking the idea of scaffolding to support ministers might not be.
We feel on the scaffold. But what would you say? What would you say to people who insist that strategy is not possible in the modern age?
I actually think it's sort of more important to have a some sort of view of actually what you're really trying to achieve, because otherwise you'll just find yourself buffeted by the sort of latest thing that's happening and forced to react, where if you've actually managed to think, actually, this is really what we're about achieving and this is why we're doing this, it will give you sort of a greater robustness, I think, about sticking the course, which I think is one of the things that you may be pressured not to do. So I actually think that's wrong. I don't think there's any reason why the modern age makes strategy more difficult. I think sticking to it may be harder, but I think actually makes it more important.
Done.
Thank you. So we're asking our witnesses to give us examples of good examples of UK strategic thinking being deployed in practice. Could you illustrate for us where you think it works? Perhaps with Matthew to start with.
I'll give you a couple of examples in the past. I think if you look back at the work of the Social Exclusion Unit under the first New Labour government, I think that took a very distinctive approach to thinking about strategy. It brought together a wide range of people with a very focused problem in mind, and it undertook a very detailed analysis of the root of the problem rather than the symptoms of the challenge. It also had success. Tangibly, it changed things out there on the streets in Scunthorpe, Swindon, wherever. So I think the Social Exclusion Unit was very interesting. Also Short Start. Short Start is an interesting case study if you think about strategic capacity, because strategic capacity is very hard, it tends to be long-term and it's complex. Short Start was a very ambitious, potentially transformative agenda that crossed generations. What happened with Short Start, arguably, is that a distinction emerged between good policy and good politics, and the politics won out.
Well, I'm going to come in on Short Start because we did a case study of Short Start and we had a very interesting and informative round table. And actually, one of the comments I remember, a very senior backbencher now, said that actually it in many ways sort of was she said, typical New Labour effort, maybe that's a bit political, but that actually there was a lot of emphasis on building Short Start centres. There actually was much less clarity about what was supposed to happen in those Short Start centres. And one of the effects of that, in a sense, for not having a strategy for Short Start, was that every time the minister changed, and one of the problems in the UK government, why strategy I think is quite important, is we have a lot of ministerial churn. The objectives of what the workforce within the Short Start Centre is supposed to be delivering changing. 1 minute it was, assistance to very young parents, unskilled parents who potential interventions there. Other times it was increasing female employment by offering a sort of childcare thing. So it changed. So I think her view was if they'd had a proper strategy for what to do with the centres, it would have actually been a more effective intervention than it was.
I was thinking about this question. I agree with that, but I was coming at it slightly differently, which is that probably one of the more successful sort of strategic interventions approaches, thinking about my time as a civil servant in the coalition government, was austerity, which sounds like a sort of perhaps a slightly odd thing to say, because you think of the coalition government, you think of the programme for government, which I would argue was really important, but was a list of actions rather than a strategy. The strategy of that government as a whole was austerity. Why was it a successful strategy? Whatever you think about the pros and cons of the direction of travel, because it involved marrying a political project with the government administration and provided a means to take difficult decisions over the course of that whole Parliament. And I think the driving factor for that government was in large part based around that, and both a political and administrative desire to balance the books and so on. So I think that's quite an interesting example at a kind of macro level.
I'm intrigued that, Matthew, you came up with Sure Start as an example of good strategy, and Jill said it actually wasn't good strategy because it descended into debate about buildings or employment, because it wasn't properly thought through. Could you just clarify what you think the best things were about that policy?
Well, I think Sure Start took a generational approach to understanding how certain people born into certain circumstances needed extra support around them. It did attempt to build capacity through Sure Start centres up and down the country, and I think actually if you look statistically you can see a lot of success now that Sure Start can be credited with. But I would also agree with Jill's point. One of the issues around a strategy is that by definition you want a strategy to be clear, succinct, but at the same time it's got to be flexible and agile. I think about education policy today and all the different things that are laid down at the school or at the door of schools. So I think the issue with understanding strategic thinking is that the strategy is a flexible direction of travel and framework within which certain policies may change if and when ministerial priorities or ministerial post holders themselves change. But at least you still should have a strategic view of where you're going and why.
I mean, if I could add an example, I think the Climate Change Act, in a sense, by setting a long-term goal for net zero, has actually conditioned thinking. We can debate how good the net zero strategy is, but by dint of saying actually this is something that we are aiming at, and I think it has actually, in a sense, reduced the sort of potential buffeting that might have had in the coalition years by being a bit of an anchor of a public commitment, and also a very important signal to the private sector as well, which I think is an important additional element of government being clear about its big long-run objectives, is that government itself can't do everything, and it's quite important to do that. So I think the idea of the Climate Change Act was quite a good example of strategic thinking from outside government, then imported into government.
So that would be an example of the strength of the current UK strategic thinking, although of course it depends on political consensus in order to get carried from one government to another. Can you think of some weaknesses of our current strategic thinking and things that could become strengths?
Well, I'll pitch in, but I'm very aware that we have the chair of the Treasury Select Committee here. I think we have an incredibly unstrategic approach to the tax policy, and we're seeing that being played out now. We had to sort of do it budget by budget. We did briefly have, in the early 2010s, a clear approach, at least on the corporate tax side, but since 2016 we've seen going in one direction on corporate tax, another direction, and because we sort of treat tax very much as a thing where the Treasury shies away from anything that looks like any sort of tax strategy, we end up just making sort of policy, just in debating it in the weeks running up to the budget and waiting for the Chancellor to produce the famous rabbit. So I think that's probably at the worst end. I speak as an ex-Treasury official who used to do tax policy, but I think we see the lack of that. It's quite interesting. The Chancellor may be about effectively doing quite an interesting structural reform of the way we tax income, but he's not presenting it as that. If he cuts national insurance again tomorrow, who knows? But it's quite interesting rebalancing with freezing the tax thresholds, but never presented as a big major rethink of the way in which we tax different sorts of income in the UK.
And I think Alex raised a really good point at the beginning, that we do have a strategic approach at the moment, but it is too often muddling through. And when you think about the case studies of positive that we started on, they are exceptions to the general rule. And what we don't have is a systemic emphasis on strategic thinking. And what we lack, going back to the, possibly unfortunate scaffolding analogy, is the internal and external challenge which the Climate Change Act has put in place in that discrete area. The weaknesses are well known: churn, siloed thinking, departmentalitis, high levels of adversarialism, policy advice developed in secret. In many ways, if you were going to design a system to mitigate against strategic thinking, you'd probably end up with quite close to what we've got.
I also think we are poor at identifying a strategy and turning it into a set of priorities and objectives at the start of a parliament. So as well as in the individual areas, governments have tended not to take advantage of that moment at the start of a parliament to translate a manifesto into a plan for government, to begin to wrestle with the trade-offs and to give the civil service and other departments and the whole system of government and those who want to work with government a clear idea of what their strategy is. And I don't think governments have been good at doing that. Look at the King's speech. It's largely a list of legislation. It's not a it's not a description of how the government wants to go about its business. We've been working for the last year or so on this commission on the centre of government. We're launching it on Monday, and one of the things we will say as a trail is that there's a strategic vacuum in that sense at the heart of government. Government's prime ministers don't take advantage of the opportunity to set out their stall. As we were saying earlier, that doesn't mean there's no strategy, but it does mean that the Treasury, for its strengths, steps in and spending reviews for the strategy, and so decisions are taken in the absence of a clear kind of guiding light.
A final quick question from me. You gave some evidence from the Institute on international comparators, and you pointed to Finland and Singapore, where they've embedded strategic thinking into their structures of government. Are they the best examples? Are there things that we can translate here from those or other examples?
Well, I think I'll kick on the Finland and Singapore interesting, particularly because Singapore sort of tried to institutionalise it, as Singapore often does. I think there are some other interesting examples. The Netherlands and how they do spending reviews is quite interesting. They take they're much more sort of issue specific, and they take a particular policy problem or policy question and look at that through the lens of a spending review, really kind of wrestle it to the ground, and then set budgets that way. Canada deploys mandate letters, which sort of happen inside government a bit at the moment, but I would argue aren't terribly successful in setting out a coherent view of what the government should do. I would say there should be a much more sort of public setting of mandates based around priorities. Scotland and Wales do interesting things as well about programmes for government, so I think there are points to learn there.
Yeah, the Netherlands also has a scientific council for government policy, which is an independent body established in legislation, which is there to bring together the evidence on big looming future issues coming down the line, and to generate and corral the evidence around those issues and deliver it to both Parliament and government, and both then have to issue a formal response. And that really does set in train an emphasis on strategic thinking that we're completely lacking here. There is more broadly, internationally, a big literature on what's now called positive public administration, which is learning from success and how to embed strategic thinking. There's a huge literature on learning from policy successes. Very little of that work ripples into the day-to-day life and understanding of the civil service. There's no need that it shouldn't.
Ian Stewart.
Thank you. You touched on the role of the centre of government, number 10 in the Cabinet Office. Without giving away too much of your publication next week, what should its role be? And how well does number 10 in the Cabinet Office fulfil that currently?
Very happy to keep plugging, so thank you for the opportunity. We're saying there are lots of roles for the centre of government. I won't go into all of them now. Jill's written about them as well. I'm sure Matthew has too. But we're saying the primary role, particularly in this context, is to set direction. And from what I said earlier, you won't be surprised to learn that we think that the centre of government is not as good as it should be at setting direction. We also argue that the Prime Minister is, like it or not, the executive leader of the government and should be supported as such. So we think the centre of government should be geared around the priorities that the Prime Minister sets. Now, you can argue about the institutional arrangements, and I won't give the game away too much by saying what we'll say next week, but I do think there should be a more coherent centre that firstly helps a Prime Minister to set their government, the whole government priorities. It's not about cutting out Secretaries of State or anything else, but helps a Prime Minister set and then present those whole government priorities, and then is geared around delivering those priorities with as clear a distinction as you can get between the proactive and the strategic and the reactive, which will always kind of flow into the centre of government. I would say that Number 10 and the Cabinet Office are not strongly set up, despite excellent people often working there. Institutionally, they're kind of grinding against each other, which then the strong institution of the Treasury kind of comes in. And what we need to do is harness the power of the Treasury to a whole government agenda that should come from Number 10 and the Cabinet Office as that part of the centre.
The Cabinet Office, it's had functions transferred to it over the years. It has had a significant increase in staffing, over threefold over the last 8 or 9 years. You've previously suggested, the IFG has previously suggested that it's responsible for everything but has little real control. So if it's had all this extra resources and functions, why has it not been giving that strategic lead?
Because the resources and the functions haven't gone into the sort of the strategic part of the Cabinet Office, if you like. That increase in headcount, you're completely right. Again, we will argue that the Cabinet Office is becoming coherent in how it's organised, is around the functions of government, so human resources, commercial, project management, digital. All of that needs to be done somewhere. I think you could argue you could slim it down a bit, but that activity needs to happen somewhere. But it has, there are two very distinct parts of the Cabinet Office: the bit that does strategy and brokering and the Secretariat, and the bit that does the kind of mechanics and running of government. Cabinet Office has also had, it's got Veterans Affairs, it's got aspects of the borders, it's got all sorts of kind of add-on bits of policy that I think you need to kind of clean out and keep its policy function to the strategic and the brokering, and then certain limited aspects of the Constitution and the Union and policy on that. I would argue.
And what's the right balance between the centre of government being, I'm going to borrow for sort of some railway terminology, a guiding mind, as opposed to being the fat controller who directs everything? And what should be when you've got cross-cutting issues, to what extent should individual departments be able to, left alone, to cooperate together?
The balance of departmental autonomy vis-à-vis the centre has always been an issue of tension and debate. It's quite clear and increasingly clear, though, that the centre doesn't have the capacity to act as a strategic brain in quite the way that it needs to. The system is supposed to work like a hub and spoke model, with the Cabinet, Number 10, Treasury at the hub, directing, controlling, coordinating the various spokes. That really isn't working at the moment, and there have been so many different reforms over the years, but they tend to be very partial. Number 10 will develop different policy units, delivery units, but there's a huge amount of institutional churn even at the centre. What there isn't is any really systemic, strategic approach to joining up. There's no lack of strategic reports out there at the moment. The fact is, though, that they're incredibly fragmented and all over the place. What we need is a central strategy under which everything else then coexists.
I agree with that. The central government shouldn't be doing very much. It should be setting direction and then holding the rest of government to account for achieving that direction. And again, I think one of the things we will argue next week is that a weak centre, we've said the UK is a highly centralised country, but with a weak centre also has an impulse then to control and to draw in policy and decision making, from levelling up funds through to some of the decisions taken in COVID, through to chess sets for local authorities, being a bit trivial. And I believe that one of the reasons for that sort of impulse to control actually stems from a weakness. And so I think if you strengthen the centre in setting strategic direction, and it's focusing on the things it really should be focusing on, it's then perhaps less likely to intervene in those areas that are kind of more marginal and aren't really about the kind of direction setting that the centre has to do.
One final quick question from me for this part. What lessons can be drawn from successful coordinations, such as the vaccine task force and rollout, which was a high-pressured, immediate, important task? What lessons can be learned from that to apply more widely in strategic thinking?
The lessons that can be learned is that amazing things happen in times of crises, and bureaucracies, processes, institutions that formerly struggle to work together can suddenly find ways of adapting very quickly under very specific pressures. I also think one of the key issues is around leadership. Very often strategic capacity is built around individuals, and it's them that are pushing for it. They believe in it. They understand the need to have this integrated ability. But then when those individuals move on, it's not been embedded systemically.
Clear objectives and the right people, the two things I'll pull out. But,
No, I think it's. I've seen that in other areas. We've done case studies on reduction in homelessness and things like that. That when you focus on a problem, the question is then extrapolating that to business as a bit more normal. And Vaccine Task Force did work under very interesting conditions where basically it was almost money was no object, because getting a good vaccine deployed quickly was such good value for money that they could work. Most people work under far more constraints than that.
Baldwin?
Yeah, it leads very well into my questions, Chair. So thank you very much, because obviously, ultimately follow the money. And as we were hearing in terms of the one of the big ways in which things get centralised is through the Treasury being basically in control of what gets spent. And they have a huge influence right across government. Do you think they do the strategic setting well, or could they do it better? Jill?
Thank you. I think the really interesting question about the Treasury, and I'm sure I've got more to say, is how much is the Treasury sort of completely bought into and supporting overall government strategy? So I think there's a question about the spending review. Is the spending review really aligning with what the government has said its critical priorities were? I mean, most government spending can't go on critical priorities. Most public spending has to go on what it went on before. But I think there's a really interesting question about where does that come from. And I think the Treasury's tendency to pick off departments to get the settlements it can, one by one, actually mitigates against having a very clear sort of strategic approach to spending allocation. I think in tax policy, the Treasury is not really a team player, doesn't buy, it sort of works out only it has the responsibility for raising revenue, and that's quite difficult. But I think the way in which tax policy and measures in the budget are developed is absolutely inimical to strategic thinking, and I think could be much, much better. And so I think the Treasury should become a sort of really important sort of, partner in delivery. It obviously has a really important role on control and value for money, but I think too much at the moment it's sort of slightly at arm's length from the core missions of the government and not acting supportive enough. But that's something Alex's report has more to say on.
But it's exactly that. I mean, I think the Treasury sets strategy pretty well for the Treasury, and that's fine. That's that's what it's there to do, and each department should be able to do that. So for the Treasury strategy, so I'd say it's it depends who's leading the Treasury, and actually one of the things our previous research has found is that rather than being the kind of sort of institutional behemoth sort of resistor that the Treasury is sometimes seen, it's actually a highly politically attuned department. It's politically attuned to the Chancellor, and again that's fine. So if the Chancellor's priorities are to balance the budget, that will be what the Treasury strategy is designed to achieve. But what we are arguing, is that, as Jill said, it's about harnessing the power of the Treasury to a whole government strategy, some of which will absolutely involve balancing the budgets or promoting economic growth. But that's a political decision for the Prime Minister and ministers. So we will be proposing a a different process by which you reach spending allocations, for example, that is a more collective process rather than one that is solely owned by the Treasury. So it's, as I say, harnessing it for those cross-government objectives. I think there are interesting and good arguments for splitting the Treasury. I think there are also good reasons not to split the Treasury. So I'd be more interested in harnessing its power before you start dismantling it. But we may come on to talk about that.
You'll have seen Lord Maud's report on exactly this topic. So I think that he wants the function of spending control to be completely moved out of the Treasury to a new Office of Budget and Management. Do you support that as being able to help address some of these issues?
I think it's a perfectly coherent plan. There's a large part of me that thinks let's not dismantle one of the bits of the government machine that we think actually does work, and I worry about you always have to draw lines somewhere, but I worry about divorcing spending decisions too much from the overall macroeconomic management of the economy that the Treasury does and the fiscal position. Lord Maud recommends ways around that, and I think that's interesting. As I say, but before we go there, I would be interested in working to better align the decisions that are made currently sort of not entirely exclusively, but quite heavily exclusively by the Treasury in a single line to the Prime Minister and then individual departments, as Jill was describing, trying to align those more to whole government priorities before we move around with too many kind of machinery of government changes.
Yeah, and Professor Flinders, machinery of government changes, abolishing whole departments, setting up whole new departments and so on. Does that help or hinder strategic?
Well, there's certainly got a long history of merging abolitions, overlords and various attempts to join up government. I think there is more we can do with trying to break down the siloed thinking. We've had experiments with joint teams, joint ministers that could be taken forward. I think a real innovation, if there were to be a cross-governmental strategy, would have more of a matrix model, where you had ministers for departments, then ministers for thematic topics in a much clearer way than we've done in the past, because it's tended to be fairly sort of ad hoc in how we've used that model. But the biggest thing, I'm always slightly suspicious about institutional reforms, process reforms. For me, embedding and rebuilding or building strategic capacity is about culture, and it's about understanding, training and skills within the civil service and within ministers. And unless you have that cultural commitment to understanding why strategy matters, you can divide the cake all day.
Could I just build on that by saying I think absolutely ministers are absolutely critical in this, because civil servants take their lead from their ministers, and if their ministers are absolutely clear that they see rather than regard their department as their sort of fiefdom for now, they actually see their department as a sort of critical enabler of a cross-cutting government goal, and that's how they want their department to behave rather than defending its budget and doing that, then civil servants will take their cue from that. If they think their sort of minister is sort of basically they're going in and putting their minister into bat for the department, because I think one of the risks in the way in which we make decisions, particularly the sort of cabinet committee process when it happens, is that we end up with too much sort of lowest common denominator policy that everyone can live with but nobody really likes, rather than mechanisms to confront ministers with genuine, real choices, difficult political choices that ministers, not civil servants, should be making, and then task departments to go away and do their bit for it and be held properly to account.
Can I just enter a really naughty word? P word, politics here. There is a very clear politics of strategic capacity that we need to be honest and open about. It's very easy for us to sit here and say it'd be great to have a cross-governmental strategy and a cascade of underpinning documents and processes. There is a very strong political dimension for ministers in the sense that maintaining strategic ambiguity can be very helpful. It creates capacity for blame shifting and blame games if and when things go wrong, and strategic thinking is very, very difficult. There's also a more short-term dimension that if you are to harness strategic thinking, then you need ministers to understand that they might not get the credit for what they've done within 2, 3 years, 18 months. You're essentially embedding a long-term thinking, and the reward structures through which ministers move on and move up might have to reflect that in order to drive behavioural change.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Liam Byrne. Sorry, Clive Betts first.
I was going to follow on exactly that point, actually. We've got a problem with social care in this country. Everyone can see the problem. It's not difficult in terms of demographics to see it getting worse. People sort of instinctively know what we might have to do. The Germans had the problem identified 20, 30 years ago and brought policies in which have basically stayed in place since. And we're still arguing about it. Isn't that simply a massive failure of strategic thinking in government in this country?
Yes, we'll do.
Yeah. Yes, and of politics.
And of politics.
It was the short answer. And very, very briefly, just to add to what Matthew was saying, is that I think to solve social care, maybe a minister would stay in post for 5 years, 10 years, but a government with a secure majority has a fair shot at being in post for 5 years, which is why I come back to the need to set that priority at the start of a parliament, and then whatever minister is in place, the government's agenda should be to prosecute that. So to the extent there's a sort of strategic administrative question in there, it's persistence over the course of a parliament. But politics is the the other side of it.
I think there's also a political culture maturity dimension here, that our constitutional configuration gives us a strong ebb and flow of different parties and a high level of adversarialism. Even if a policy will seem to be working reasonably well, a new minister from a different party might not want to be seen to be sustaining that and want to terminate it for political reasons. So the issues you raise about how do you embed long-termism take you back to basic constitutional questions about cross-party working, about mature, embedded thinking, real basic questions about whether our system... The irony is that Alex raised earlier, we are globally known as a power-hoarding democracy where we should be able to get things done. But we are terrible at implementation and long-term thinking.
On pensions, we did it.
Yeah.
We actually got an agreement before the 2010 election, cross-party, and stuck to it. So it's not impossible, is it?
Not impossible, but it needs dedicated work, and on a larger scale, cultural change and maybe institutional change to bolster that.
So I think there's a really interesting issue, because the interesting issue is, why did the Turner Commission work and the Dilnot Commission on social care, the Dilnot approach on social care not work as a sort of way? And I think in a sense, this is just my view, Andrew finished too soon. He didn't go into the issue of, so how do we pay for this? I think he was slightly addressing the wrong issue as well, about capacity in social care as much as who pays, because I think both were problems, and maybe that's a bit with hindsight. But I think if the Dilnot Commission had worked more like the Turner Commission, which I think was the Pensions Commission, which I think worked brilliantly in the sense of getting everybody to agree there was a problem, and then getting a solution, and then socialising the solution and building a coalition of support for the solution before the election, I think we might be in a better place on social care. I also think institutions like, we haven't mentioned it, but the Productivity Commission in Australia, very useful, where ministers, rather than set up new reviews, can actually have a more standing capacity to outsource some of these difficult policy problems, to produce good analysis and then can go round and test opinion, have sort of open days and things like that, and do sort of policy discussions that we shy away from. But I think the Pensions Commission does show, we have a great quote in the report we did on it from James Purnell, saying it basically took the issue of raising the state pension age from something that would have been an absolute scandal to something that's on page 56 of a newspaper, whatever. And we can now outsource to John Cridland to advise on it. I mean, it's gone from being politically undoable to, well, of course, the population is getting older, so over time the pension age will increase. And we brought in automatic enrolment, did it gradually, and it wasn't blown off course by a change of government in 2010. So I think they're very strong lessons. There has to be the political will to want to do it and set up arrangements to do it. And hopefully we might get that. And then a refusal to play politics with it by labelling things death and dementia taxes in a very unuseful way.
Ian Byrne.
Thanks very much, Chair. So it does feel like we're at one of those moments where we've got some big geopolitical shifts. We're having quite a lively debate about new sovereign capabilities that our country might need, and therefore this imperative of stronger state organisation and new strategic thinking feels like it is coming up the agenda somewhat. Are you aware anywhere that these strategic thinking skills are being developed either amongst ministers or civil servants? Let me start with Alex.
No. I mean, not in a coherent way. And I was very interested in the evidence you had from Pamela Dow, for example, that sort of talked about some of her efforts to kind of inject this in a pragmatic sense. Because I think it is always going to be difficult to teach sort of strategic capability or to build skills and strategic capability outside of the work that an individual civil servant or minister is doing. So there's something about how do we build in these sorts of questions to the actual situation as it exists and the policy and implementation problems that ministers and civil servants are grappling with. Is that injecting particular experts, enabling conversations, allowing the kind of discussions about trade-offs to happen? I think there's a quite a sort of, there is a role, but a narrow role for teaching strategy.
Do you think we know how to do it?
I think some civil servants know how to do it, but it's quite.
Do we know how to develop those strategic thinking skills?
I'm not sure there's been enough work done on that. Okay. So no, I think.
Jill, what do you think?
I would probably defer to Alex on that, but I would say that I think the last few years have been so unstable and difficult to navigate, with changes of direction coming through really quite frequently. We've had a lot of ministerial change and changes in circumstances, and then suddenly being confronted with go from Brexit to the pandemic and things like that, that I think the bandwidth has been very badly stretched inside government to do anything. Though people did say, people who worked on, I'm not a foreign policy expert at all, people who did the integrated review refresh said they thought that process was much better than the first integrated review, and they were able to sort of bring in more thinking, more insights, and actually felt that there was a better environment for strategic thinking then.
I think it's very interesting. If you look at the submission of evidence that's come to this committee from the Cabinet Office, it's quite clear that there's a lot going on, but it's really fragmented all over the place. What we don't have is any overarching strategy which is catalysing, connecting and forging collaborations within those little pools of excellence that we have. So there is stuff going on. I think the creation of a new hub for the Centre of Excellence for the policy profession in Sheffield is a huge opportunity to inject a strategic lens through everything we do, which has potential. But at the moment, there's a lot of activity, but it is itself, it's almost hyperactivity.
We live in an age of the shockwave now. We've had to go through this ABC of British political history of austerity, Brexit, COVID. This could be a new normal. So it could be that the challenge is that we've got to both retain the capacity to deal with pretty big shocks, while at the same time as developing strategic thinking capability both amongst civil servants and politicians. And so help us God, we might want to try and do that together at times.
Yes, and I think, listening to this conversation, it's thought-provoking. There's something about active permission being given to civil servants to do this sort of stuff, absolutely under political control.
Today, Alex, do you think?
I think they have less active permission now than they have done in the past for some of the reasons that Jill and Matthew talked about. And I think it would be in successive governments' interests to be, giving that active permission to want more challenge and more sort of policy engagement. There's something a bit too passive at the moment about the way the civil servants talk about their role.
Sorry, Matt.
You go.
I was going to say, I wrote a paper for the Institute for Government's Constitutional Review, which I wrote as an independent person in December a year ago, which was arguing that the civil service should be able to do more on its own account, for which ministers don't have to be held to account. And I think some of the sort of, thinking through difficult future problems, which ministers may not want to be commissioning work on, it would actually be good if, as part of their sort of stewardship, longer-term capacity role of being ready for shocks, ready for change of direction, we tasked Permanent Secretary with actually making sure the department was across future developments and was actually doing some, it wouldn't be a huge, big thing, but actually being able to do that without ministers having to appear and defend what they were doing. We had this way back in 97 when I was Press Secretary at the Treasury, when a document by the Treasury Strategy Unit was leaked to the Shadow Chancellor, and the Chancellor was confronted with it. You're planning, for the UK to join the Euro. He probably would have been happy to, but he wasn't. At the time, he was planning to make the Bank of England independent. That was in a Treasury document which he'd never seen, was totally unaware of, and he, dismissed it. But actually, I think that's the sort of thinking that you should be allowing departments to do, but at the moment, because they just work for the government of the day, they're actually not authorised to do.
Before you come in, Matthew, so in terms of incentives, culture, behaviours, do you think they're in the right place to foster the kind of strategic thinking skills we need today?
I think it's totally dependent on who your minister is.
Yes.
If you have a sort of far-sighted, I might say, sounds patronising, sort of grown-up secretary who accepts that there are lots of different views, that you're preparing for things, you're thinking things, maybe, Ken Clarke sort of brushed it off, he was fine with it, dismissed it as a kid in the office. Some others, I think, would be much more sensitive and think you were doing things and undermining their agenda. So I think it's, a conversation, but it's very inconsistent. It's very personality-driven and relationship-driven.
Matthew, what do you want to add?
I was just going to add that role of independent, frank, hard discussions outside of government depoliticises exactly what the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy provides. I think there's... we talk about strategic capacity through a deficit model, and it's quite clear there is a deficit, but I think it's really important to understand that there is also a huge opportunity here, a positive opportunity to reframe and reimagine how we make policy with a real clear strategic focus that we have never had before. So I'm just quite concerned that when we have this debate, it's always slightly pessimistic. We look at the past, it's never worked, boom, boom, boom. I think we are, because of exactly the issues that you've just raised, a window of opportunity is opening where there will be a much stronger awareness of the rationale and why strategic thinking matters. And I think that the report that the committee is doing could really put down some of the blueprint and structure around what that might look like. At the moment, it's not systemic at all. It's not cultural at all, but that can change.
Clive Betts.
Yes, about the young people. The issues, some of the big issues that affect the country now around climate change, around building of homes for the future, are really going to impact on young people. Yeah, we're not very good, are we, at engaging with young people. I'll just give you one example that has amazed me today. We're just looking as a committee at long-term planning of the built environment and the impact on young people. So we looked at the National Planning Policy Framework, the government's framework for planning. There's 2 mentions of bats, 2 mentions of lorry parking, and 1 mention of young people in the whole document. Does that show us that, in terms of our long-term thinking strategy, we just don't take young people into account and what the future might hold for them?
No, but I think this goes back to the point I was just making about the opportunity. The public are strategic actors, and pulling them into the process through... One of the great issues with our making a public policy, as Jill just said, is it's incredibly secretive. Actually engaging through innovative ways that we know now a lot about what works when it comes to deliberation, participation, reaching hard-to-reach groups that are called hard to reach for a reason or another, they can provide and be pulled into these more open, expansive conversations about what does our strategic future look like and how do we get there together. It's very worrying, and I must just raise this, the latest research on young people's commitment and trust in the values of democracy is very, very worrying. The gap between young people and political institutions, political processes and politicians is absolutely shocking, and we need to close that gap through innovation and reimagining, and again thinking and bringing them into the conversation about how do they want to redefine their lives. There's a double dynamic. Not only does it add to the value pluralism through which policy is made at a strategic level, but the process itself is also shown to rebuild public trust and confidence and understanding about why politics is so hard. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there, didn't I? Gosh!
Can you expand on how strategy in government becomes a whole of society approach?
Not calling it strategy is probably part of it, not to be too flippant, but I think trying to get into it, because, I mean, thinking about what Matthew was saying there, that, Wales is quite interesting on young people and future generations commissioner at the moment. There's a danger, though, I think, in that being... I mean, it obviously does need to be in the sort of advocacy sphere and at the kind of overall strategic level. But I think it's about embedding civic participation in what I would call as a form of civil policy, the kind of the policy decisions that are being made in government. So absolutely having a sort of input at the strategic level, but embedding throughout the decisions that politicians, ministers, governments are taking every day, the kind of the interests and kind of views of the whole of society, however you define it, which is for politicians, of which I'm not one.
It's part of the strategy on strategy. How do you engage with multiple publics in multiple ways to bring them into the conversation? How do you promote democratic listening, not just democratic voice? And actually, young people are massively interested in politics. We all know this around the room. I do gigs in pubs, rugby clubs, churches, and it's about creating the fresh, boundary-spanning structures through which younger people feel they really can be heard and play a role.
One of the things that we've made it impossibly difficult to do by the changes that Lord Maud made to, and the GDS made to .gov.uk, this is a personal bête noire of mine, is you can't work out what the government's trying to do. If you look on .gov.uk, it works perfectly well if I'm on a new driving licence or a passport, but it's a disaster area in terms of communicating what the government's objectives are, what it's trying to do. I might go to, the Prime Minister's 5 pledges or whatever, but I can't find that in anything Gov.uk. If I look on the education pages, I can't find out what the government's trying to achieve on education. I can't find out what DEFRA's trying to achieve or anything, because it's just a sort of uncurated morass of recent announcements. It's an absolute mess.
We need a mission-driven government. Maybe that's...
I'm sure Lord Maud will want to respond to what you've just said.
It works perfectly well for citizens, for consumers, but it works hopelessly for citizens.
I think he would argue that
and accountability.
That was the emphasis, but maybe it shouldn't have been. Maybe it should have been broader. But can we just round this session off as briefly as we can? But looking at how Parliament can engage in this to promote strategic thinking through select committees, perhaps, because if politics is a problem, what can Parliament put in place that could control this? I mean, people suggest a strategy review body with powers analogous to the OBR. But would that be a parliamentary body, or would that be an internal government body? The OBR is not a parliamentary body. What do you think about that?
I think some of the things that we'd be recommending around clarity at the start of a government about priorities would enable Parliament to then get a lock on that, and and a body like the Liaison Committee can then say, all right, we understand what your priorities are, let's scrutinise that. And I think that points to a frustration, Sir Bernard, you will be more familiar with than we are about how difficult it is from the parliamentary committee's perspective to kind of get a lock on government if government doesn't itself have the structures that you can scrutinise. So I think a central government institution, I wouldn't create a kind of new sort of separate strategy thing, but whether it's the Cabinet Office number 10, some kind of variation of that could be actively scrutinised by a committee like this one would help. I also think there are, as Matthew said earlier, government is not short of strategies, but those those documents that get closest to sort of giving a window on government's overall strategy are often very boring. So it's the departmental kind of statement of accounts. It's outcome delivery plans. So I think taking those really seriously, and Parliament showing government that it's taking those really seriously is one kind of way to get in. And I won't sort of get into kind of how Parliament might organise itself.
I just finished with Professor Flinders, because you've talked a lot about a collaborative partnership between the executive and the legislature. This isn't how it works at the moment.
I know, and that's why if we want to be fit for the future, we need to change how we work. And part of that is that MPs on select committees will have to have some self-restraint when faced with ministers who do dare to put down some strategic ambitions in a very complex and turmoil-based world. I don't think there's a need for a new select committee. I think that maybe the addition of the core tasks might be of some benefit, but overall, the issue around a strategic lens within parliamentary scrutiny is going to come from the Liaison Committee. It's going to be also potentially a role for the Liaison Committee going forward. And really interesting, we've not touched on them, but in many ways, this role is also, you might say, better fitting with the Select Committee in the House of Lords. So I think there are interesting ways of promoting what I'm calling a strategic lens, but it's going to come more from leadership from people around this table than it will be from necessarily creating new institutions or new pieces of paper.
Well, that's my final question, really, is what is the government not producing that select committees should be able to scrutinise?
I think, as Alex said, a sort of starting point is we don't have, President Biden's about to give his State of the Union speech, we don't have a sort of, one coherent sort of speech by the Prime Minister where he sets out, this is actually what my government is about achieving, or a document, and this is what we think are the most important things doing, this is what we're trying to do, and these are the policies and how we're allocating resources to try and do it. And I think that would be incredibly helpful to do that. You have sub-strategies, but you don't have that sort of big linking narrative, because we don't use the King's speech in that way. Yeah. We get a bit of that in the budget, but obviously with a sort of very arcane lens on it. So I think that's the miss. You don't have a statement to which to hold them to account.
You've got a manifesto. You've got what the Prime Minister says on the tarmac in Downing Street. You've got a King's speech. You've got all these different
the coalition
bits, but you don't have a coherent translation of the government's political objectives into a programme for government.
Yeah. Liam, last word.
Just very briefly, I mean, as you mentioned there, Jill, I mean, we have had these moments in the past. So the coalition agreement actually had Gantt charts that Oliver Letwin used to oversee. We had once upon a time Prime Minister's strategy unit, Prime Minister's delivery unit, reasonably clear delivery objectives. I mean, there may be some things in the past that could be perhaps restored as a model. Any that you'd highlight?
I do think the programme for government of the coalition is an important one, although, as I said earlier, that was a list of actions. It really guided the government's objectives and what the government did, but it was a list of actions rather than sort of outcomes. So I think you can take that as a starting point and elevate it. I agree with you on some of the sort of internal institutional points. I think a unit focused on priorities, on delivery and on performance would be very helpful.
And the bit that was missing for me in the programme for government was sort of any analysis of actually why these things, the sort of, if you like, the problem statement at the start of what are we trying to do. So I'm about to go to an event on missions-based government, so I'm very interested to see whether there's any thinking on that.
Thank you very much for joining us. We have to move on to our next witness.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Most grateful to you. We're now joined by Lord Robertson of Port Ellen. Good afternoon, Lord Robertson. I will plunge straight in if that's possible. We shared some wording with you about what a shared understanding of strategic thinking might look like. How does this appeal to you? Or maybe you haven't seen it.
Well, you may have sent it, and I may not have read it.
How do we persuade government that they need to have a shared understanding of what strategic thinking and strategy is, and what should it look like?
Well, we persuade them by illustrating with issues that are not being dealt with and cannot be dealt with inside the existing structures. And I think that's an easier way than trying to find a vocabulary that sort of describes something that is not easy to describe. But if you say, what Charles Clarke wrote a book about, the too difficult box. So if you look at issues about how do we deal with China in all its manifestations, how do we deal with AI, with both its risks and its opportunities, how do we deal with care of the elderly, how do we get to net zero? All of these are multi-departmental issues which cannot be dealt with by individual departments, and yet British government is run according to individual departments. I was Secretary of State for Defence, and I remember on day one effectively being told, you will be judged by how well you do for defence. So the measurement, you leave the collegiate atmosphere of the shadow cabinet, you become a minister, a Secretary of State, and then you're told that's the box on which you're going to be judged. And indeed, Gordon Brown then set up a committee called PX, which examined the public expenditure of all departments. And individual Secretaries of State were arraigned before this courtroom of our peers being the people who had very small budgets, and were then cross-examined about our department as well. The effect was not to produce a much more manageable view of an individual department's accounts. You became a patriot for your department because you had to learn it. You had no officials with you. 0 officials, which I can tell you is a scary proposition for anybody new to a department. So it's the ways and means and ends of policy in the areas more explicably projected as being the ones that we can't deal with by individual departments.
What would you say to people that insist that strategy is not possible in this very complicated and fast-moving age?
Say rubbish. It's got to be. We've got to deal with these problems. Some of these problems are there in front of us today. And you can have a Prime Minister standing on the door of Downing Street and saying, I've got a plan for care, the care system, when he didn't have and couldn't have and wasn't going to have. But that doesn't help with the problem that is then faced by hospitals that are bed blocked because care in the community is something unaffordable. How do we deal with the manifest problems that will face us with artificial intelligence, and yet the opportunities that are also there for all of us to grab hold of it? So a strategic approach is the only way in which you are going to be able to deal with it. And I listened to the last contributions there, which I thought were interesting, about politicians wanting quick deals. And that's right, and there are politicians around this table. But some of the bigger issues have to be dealt with strategically, when other issues are the day-to-day issues that you're faced with, and which can produce, if you want, the quick wins.
Right, we need to speed on through as quickly as possible. After you, we've got Lord Sedwill.
I know.
Ian Stewart.
Thank you. So looking at the role of the centre of government, number 10 in the Cabinet Office, in overseeing those important cross-departmental strategic issues, to what extent should they be a guiding mind and allow the individual departments to cooperate? And to what extent should they be a directing mind?
I think they need to be a much more centralising organism than they are at the present moment. And in the evidence that I produced for the committee, which, you know, I know that the amount of material you must have is huge, but the paper I sent in was the product not just of my view, but of a group of people, which the chairman of this committee is a member of the group, but he's not an author of this report. But our group includes members of Parliament from the major political parties, you know, a couple of Labour MPs who then became members of the shadow cabinet. We've got senior military officers, think tank specialists, industrialists, former and present senior civil servants and NGO executives as well. Part of a group of people who are concerned about the way in which we are not able to deal with these grand strategic issues. And this paper highlights the way in which not only do we analyse the problem, which this committee has been set up to look at, but we actually give you a series of prescriptions. So your question is answered in this in this paper. What we're going to do now, the group, is going to write to all the political parties with 2 specific ideas out of our discussions. You know, and we'll have a lot more to come to, but 2 that we believe are important. One is that we should establish a school of government to which civil servants and members of Parliament would go to learn about the way the system operates and how it might better operate. That's completely lacking at the moment. And I speak for somebody who's been in Parliament for 45 years. We preach lifelong learning and we do nothing. We are the one group of people for whom we don't actually do anything in terms of real, genuine education and training. So a school of government would deal with that. And the second proposal is the creation of a joint committee of both houses for the future. Based, you know, there is the Welsh model, which I think previous witnesses were describing, which is alive and well and working in Finland as well. So, you know, in terms of the specific question that you ask, yes, there needs to be a much greater coordination at the centre from the Prime Minister's office through a series of other mechanisms that will bring together the cross-cutting issues that need multi-departmental consideration, and also building in the devolved administrations, which we too often, and a lot of the academics who give you evidence forget completely that there are all of these areas that have now been devolved completely, you know, with legislative power, and we tend to think, therefore, in terms of direction, whether strategically or tactically, in terms of England, that the Cabinet Office sort of deals with England, but it has to bear in mind the fact that there are devolved authorities who not only make policy, but they deliver policy as well.
How do we encapsulate the lessons from where we have had a successful sort of coordination of policy? Take the vaccine task force. Yes, that was in a moment of high pressure, crisis had to be dealt with, but that worked by and large. How do we make that the norm?
Well, you learn the lessons and you apply the lessons. One of my frustrations in life as being a Secretary of State for Defence and then Secretary General of NATO is we're actually very good at lessons learned exercises. We are absolutely appalling for implementing the lessons as they come. I know that in NATO, you know, we had an incident, a crisis in what is now North Macedonia in 2001, and we solved it. We actually prevented a war from taking place, and we built a multi-ethnic government, which is still 20 years on, still in existence, and including some of the key insurgents. You know, the guys who actually carried the guns are now part of the government of North Macedonia. You know, and we wrote the lessons learned from that. And then when NATO went on to Afghanistan, other countries went on to Iraq, Libya, we certainly ignored completely these lessons learned. So I think we need to. So the vaccine task force was an extremely good example, but not the only example. You know, the counter-terrorism strategy under contest. Clive Betts was mentioning the pensions way in which we actually did that. Universal benefit. There's another example of how you get cross-party consensus, and it goes through the electoral cycles. So there are examples, and it would be useful if we actually learned these examples. But of course, the vaccine task force got wound up, and we went back to departmentalism.
I bet.
Yeah, you mentioned Gordon Brown's role in spending when you became Secretary of State. I mean, you think it's helpful that the Treasury is controlling spending and also almost controlling strategy as well? Do you think the two things fit well together?
No, they don't. And our paper identifies a very, very clear recommendation on that. You know, the role of the Treasury, you know, and we've got a Treasury Minister here as well, is usually to stop things from happening rather than creating things happening. And I think we need to look very carefully at the role of the Treasury. Now, next Monday, I think it is, the Institute for Government is going to publish its recommendations about reform of the civil service. And they've got John Major and Gordon Brown at the launch of the document. So two former Chancellors of the Exchequer are going to be there to tell us how to reform the system. You know, you can tell if they've been invited and they've seen it, we know what it's going to say. So yeah, the Treasury has got to be seen in a much more, has got to see itself in a positive. When I saw that, I thought, this is not a rival for my document. This is going to be give more power to the Treasury.
Right. Just in terms of how strategy can be developed better, was your experience in NATO that body was better at developing strategy than you could do it as a Secretary of State for Defence in the UK government?
Well, it wasn't when I went there. It was better when I left. But it's based on a strategic concept. So they have a process, you know, on almost every 5 years of delivering a strategic concept. And there will be another strategic concept document before the summit meeting in July of this year, which does try to give, you know, the strategic vision of what the world is that NATO is going to plug into. You know, I resisted doing one when I was there because they'd done one in 1999, which seemed to me to fit the purposes, and even mentioned terrorism, which became more high profile after 9/11. Because I thought, how am I going to get 19 countries to agree? But there is a new one, and I believe that there is a process now towards to getting that. So yes, it under duress and because of circumstance, it had to produce a strategic concept within which the organisation worked.
And that doesn't happen in government in this country.
No, I think what was being said by your previous speakers that I was listening to there was saying, you know, you've got the manifesto and you've got the King's Speech, you know, and then you've got ad hoc budgets coming along, but you don't have an overall vision of what it is, you know, we want to achieve and how these, you know, the two difficult issues are going to have to be dealt with. You know, that's where it crystallises. It's somewhat vague, and our group has struggled with this vocabulary as well, definitions. You know, but if you get bogged down in definitions, you go nowhere. But if you actually look at where the problems are, the two difficult problems, and then you recognise that our government system is far too much based on departments and how well the minister deals, you know, is responsible for the department, you begin to see why strategy is necessary.
How do you get a mechanism that gets around that then? Because, I mean, does it simply pull more power into number 10, into the Cabinet Office?
Well, no, you have a series, and you know, I don't want to take up the time of the committee because this paper is here, and we lay it out. We did a lot of thinking a lot of consultations, and we came to a series of conclusions about how that would work with a chief strategy officer. The way in which the government should systemize the strategy and operations delineation of cabinet committees, so that you're actually looking at both planning, and policy and execution, with the emphasis on delivery and execution. So I thoroughly recommend you to read the outcome of that. It won't take you hours, I can tell you.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you. George, you mentioned your ideas to re-establish a school of government. You just mentioned it just now. So what would be the essential elements of the curriculum?
Well, I think it would be to deal with the constitution of the country for a start. A lot of members of parliament, and therefore potential ministers, don't really fully understand the way in which the country operates and the system operates. You sort of learn on the job. I became an expert near the end of my political career in the way in which legislation was put together, because I was the European spokesman at the time the Maastricht Treaty came along. And I discovered, and this is after 20 years in Parliament, how the Cartesian logic of parliamentary draftsmanship was actually created. So that these are basic things which you would think were needed. We actually, the British American Parliamentary Group sends a number of new members of Parliament to the Kennedy School. It was the Kennedy School until the Heritage Foundation objected to that. So they now send members of Congress to the two different ideological departments. But we send people out there to learn about the American Constitution and American government. We don't do it here. And therefore, especially with the churn of ministers, people come in oblivious to what's going on and in the hands of some very senior civil servants who've seen it all. And they've seen off a lot of ministers, as you know only too well.
So over the years, we've had various schools and colleges of government, and different ministers or governments have transmogrified them into one thing or another and then cancelled them. Does this have to be a new institution, or should it be built around the Institute of Government or some existing set of students?
No, it has to be new, and it has to have very clear objectives in terms of the as you say, of the curriculum and who's going to go to it. But it's got to be something fairly sophisticated and detailed as well. In the Ministry of Defence, there is a Defence Academy. I found out, while I was Defence Secretary, that I had a bigger budget than the Department of Education. My education budget was bigger than the Ministry of Education was, and we did training extremely well. From kindergartens in the British Army of the Rhine right up to university standard, because we were giving degrees. And it was a study that I put in place that then created the Defence Academy, which is the umbrella organisation for all the various training elements in it. And when you look at military training, it's really, really good. We take, I remember going to HMS Raleigh, which is where the young naval recruits are involved, and they take basically school dropouts. A lot of them are people who've dropped out of school, and they turn them into remarkably self-disciplined, team-working experts, and it's remarkable to see. So it's not as though there isn't some exemplar there. If you go to the Joint Services Staff and Command College, which was a PFI project delivered on time, on budget, you begin to see how that, at the very top level, we train very senior officers and do it well.
Ministers and prospective ministers, and presumably senior civil servants, could be taught through the School of Government some of the mechanics of government, but what about strategic thinking? Would that, how do we make that a core part of the curriculum?
Well, you make that part of the curriculum. You have to do that. The Defence Academy has got a joint doctrine and concept centre, which inside the military sort of thing, that we created that as out of my defence review in 1998. But that was to be the sort of little brain inside the body that would look at concepts and strategies on a whole. So it would be embedded inside the School of Government. The idea of how you did cross-cutting issues, how you handled them, how you delivered them. And delivery is all important.
Well, how would you... sorry, Liam, it's your turn.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, your point about training is very well made. I remember before I came into politics spending several years in strategy consulting and merchant banking, and in any 1 year never had less than 4 to 8 weeks training a year. Yeah, I've been trying to get project management training for one of my staff for 2 years at the moment, so it's a point very well made. I wanted to ask you about incentives and culture and behaviours, and I wanted to ask you whether you think they're in the right place now and how they might be improved. But I just wondered if you might reflect on the importance of the strategic concept that NATO developed as a guiding star. Does that help strategic thinking? I wondered if you might also reflect, though, on moments where we have crystallised kind of rules of the road for politicians. So the Nolan principles, for example, were a reflection on a particular problem, but we did reflect on that problem, and we did then crystallise the 7 principles for participation in public life. They don't include acquiring some capability in strategic thinking, for example, but codes of conduct can be quite effective ways of changing behaviour and improving behaviour. But what are your thoughts on incentives, culture, behaviour, and how we improve them?
Well, I think incentives are important, and there may have to be built into the way in which the civil service operates some degree of incentive for actually delivering on the job. We don't have that. You just move people around from department to department, you know, and that's the way in which, you know, I think we've too often done it. We've done it with politicians. You get moved from departments, you know, depending on how well the Prime Minister thinks you are, or you get sacked very quickly. Chris Mullen talks about that in his diaries, you know, that the Prime Minister sees, you know, a question time on television where the person doesn't do terribly well, and, you know, they're out. There's no performance management for ministers, which there would be in any good company or organisation. So that, you know, that these are the things that need to be there. I tried when I was at the Ministry of Defence to end the concept of huge procurement projects that simply drifted on through the years with nobody in particular responsible to either take credit or to take the blame, and we produced integrated teams for that. My deputy at the Ministry of Defence was John Gilbert, the legendary John Gilbert, who was better at asking questions on committees than necessarily getting the answers to them. But he came in as the deputy to the Secretary of State in 1997 into the same job he'd had under Fred Mulley 18 years before in the Callaghan government, and the projects were still on the table. The Eurofighter Typhoon.
The cost got up.
What?
The cost
massively, just huge. You know, the Merlin helicopter. So yeah, so that we need to build something that is an incentive for that as well. Codes of conduct are all very well, you know, but you should have to sign them every year. You know, the Nolan. You know, could anybody around this table say what the Nolan principles are? Well, you know, I can't remember. You know, we're not asked to sign them or repeatedly sign them as you do in many parts of industry. You know, when you have to sign off every year certain elements of that. So, you know, I think that's one way in which you would have to do it. You would have to read and sign off, and that, I think, would ingrain in your mind.
Yeah. And if you think about the incentives on politicians, which are now becoming ever more short-term, I mean, they were always quite short-term. With social media, they're even more short-term than they have been in the past. How do we guard against this risk of very short-term imperatives on politicians creating very short-term imperatives for civil servants? How do we try to craft and guard some space amongst the civil servants to actually think strategically and to act strategically, when so much of the pressure that we apply is, how do we respond to this, how do we respond to that, that's just gone up on social media, I need to respond to that. We're in danger of crowding out the bandwidth, I think, in some.
Well, we do, and that's you know, the serious problem. You know, you have the problems of electoral cycles. You know, that's one of the issues. You know, you've got the issue of procrastination. It's easy just to sort of pass the issue down the line, and you know that's why I say departmentalism is one of the problems that are there. But there's no reason why a Prime Minister cannot say, here are the cross-cutting issues that I expect you to pay attention to, because they are big issues, and get a cabinet committee structure that is designed in order to make sure that happens. And then leave the other issues, you know, to tactics, to politics, you know, to the immediacy of the issues. You know, you're not going to abolish the grid, you know, the famous grid that you have to have a story every day and you've got to fill the Daily Mail. You know, sort of. You know, I met a Daily Mail reporter on the way over here today, and I said, I hear you're giving evidence to a committee. He said, sort of, you know, bone-crushing boredom. He said. You know, strategy. Well, it's not. It's the meat and drink, because, you know, if we don't deal with these two difficult issues in a strategic way, then they will overwhelm us.
If you think about when civil servants have done well for you in the past, and you'll have had good experiences and bad experiences, did you notice anything about the kinds of incentives that do foster the kind of behaviour that you want to see? What do good incentives look like?
I think my first permanent secretary wanted to be cabinet secretary, so he moved to another department. Which is an interesting story I'll tell you about sometime. You know. No, is there a financial incentive that would be there? You know, based on delivery, as you have in industry and commerce. We can't always rely on this sort of movement that takes place simply in order to do it, or you know, a knighthood or a CB or these things which are regarded as being the measurement of incentive that's there. I think we need to look, and we touch on that in this paper as well, about whether or not execution and delivery should be something that is measured and rewarded.
We've learned a lot about project management structures, often in response to serious terrorism incidents. You know, there is now a wider understanding of the virtues of gold, silver and bronze command. There are sort of project management and crisis management structures which are better established across public services. Do you think those kind of structures are widespread enough, or whether those structures could actually be used more imaginatively to try and create good ways of command?
Yeah, I think we should try any of these things. You know, being imaginative, I think, is an imperative, because, you know, we don't tend to be very imaginative about the way in which we structure government and the attitude to success and failure. So I think we should try all of these things, because building incentives in, I think, is crucial if you're going to change the culture of both the politicians and of the civil service who deliver what the politicians dictate.
Is there anything crucial you want to add? You've been very helpful.
No, I think that that covers the
Thank you very much.
covers the ground. Well, it just I'm not an academic, and I'm just somebody who's sort of an ex-minister, as we all one day will be.
And thank you for reminding me. I should have declared an interest as part of the group that we are. We are both part of a group that thinks about these matters, but I don't regard it as a conflict. But I better put it on the public record.
No, we're just a thought process, but I recommend to members of the committee the product of that, because I think you'll find it quite interesting, and it actually not only produces a diagnosis, it actually produces a few prescriptions as well.
Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you.
Our final witness is virtual. Okay, all right. I hope you get better soon.
I do as well. Yeah.
I can push till 22, and then I must go, I'm
We're
afraid.
now joined by Lord Sedwill. Can you hear us? No, I can't. We can't hear you. No, can't hear you. Can't hear you. Oh, your microphone suddenly appeared.
Sorry, yeah, your technical people kept muting me every time I tried to unmute. I think
Right,
we
I
were
see, right.
playing ping pong. I apologise for that.
It's
Sorry, I'm on Zoom. I've been at an event with the First Sea Lord and his senior team today. As one of the things I continue to try to do to help strategic thinking, at least in some parts of government.
Well, we're very grateful for you joining us, as we were grateful to you for coming to the private roundtable. If I can just kick off, during your time in government, how would you describe the government's capacity for strategic thinking?
Patchy, I think. Good in some areas, weak in others, valued in some, undervalued in others. I listened to that session with Lord Robertson. I remember actually, after doing my maiden speech following him, vowing I'd never ever follow him again in front of a parliamentary occasion. So I've broken that, but I agree with pretty much everything he said.
Thank you. We feel that there should be a shared understanding in government about what strategic thinking and strategy is. How would you describe that?
I think the language that you're thinking about looks pretty good to me. I think there are different ways of describing it. The military use the language of ends, ways and means. We tried in the National Security Capability Review in 2018 to use slightly different language, but again, thinking those terms. I think you have to have an overall strategy. You then have to have strategic plans that look to turn that strategy into something concrete, and then strategic programs which actually have milestones and resources and targets applied to them. And then you need a review mechanism to enable you to adjust. And there are different ways of doing that, but fundamentally, as I think you've been talking about, it's fine to strategize, and we often use the word strategic simply to mean big, and that isn't the same thing, of course, or even senior, and those things are not the same thing at all. But a strategy is only worth trying to consider if you're going to turn it into a program of activity, and it's through to the delivery is the key part of it.
What would you say to people who insist that national strategy is something Victorian and not possible in the modern age?
Well, I don't think you necessarily need a national strategy. Some countries can have one, but they're usually countries facing essentially an existential challenge, whether it's an economic or a security challenge. But you can have a series of national strategies on a range of different issues, and it seems to me that there should be a handful of those, because otherwise you just proliferate and create as much complexity as we have already. And it seems to me that if a government were to say at the beginning of its term, right, these are the 3, 4, 5 really big things, they're cross-cutting, they're really important, they're the things against which we're going to be judged, and the Prime Minister of the day puts a lot of heft behind them, and we can talk more about how you might deliver that, then that I think that would be beneficial. There are some areas where it can be done cross-party, and I don't think we explore those things enough. You heard about a few examples in Lord Robertson's testimony: contest, universal credit. We did that on some national security issues as well. But it doesn't have to be cross-party. It just has to be consistent.
As Cabinet Secretary, you implemented foresight and horizon scanning, and also came up with fusion doctrine. What do you think these things have achieved, and what still needs to be done?
Well, I think actually, if I look at the fusion approach, that was developed as part of that capability review. It was to try and achieve exactly what we were talking about, which was to impose some discipline from what were some very good strategic discussions in the National Security Council about our overall approach to China, or dealing with Russia, or dealing with a metastasizing terrorist threat, Islamic State, and so on. But how did that turn into actual policy action and delivery in departments? I think one of the frustrations that both David Cameron and Theresa May felt with the national security architecture was that those discussions, those ministerial discussions in the NSC, didn't really then turn into policy change, because policy change was essentially happening in the department. And so what I tried to do is build on the model Peter Ricketts had developed at the beginning of the NSC to essentially create that sort of follow through into policy programs for which a range of departments would be responsible, and each department would be regarded as essentially a member of a team, and they'd have to play their part in what was essentially a team endeavour, and impose some program structure around that in order to turn those strategic decisions, how we balanced off security and prosperity in terms of our relationship with China, for example. That's a tricky, entirely political decision. How do you turn that then into actions that ensure that the government's approach is coherent, and don't find yourself running two contradictory policies towards China? And that was the effort we made. It was successful in some areas. It was less successful in others.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you. You, in your evidence, you gave some examples, and the chairman just referred to some. And you just mentioned earlier that the strategic thinking was patchy in government. What were some of the examples of good that you came across during your time as Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I think the ones that we've talked about, I mean, inevitably, because I became Cabinet Secretary really with a national security background, and so was probably, I mean, I had my own biases, if you like, as I probably tried to take too much of that into the job of Cabinet Secretary. But I think there were areas in national security where we got it right. I've just mentioned China. I think actually we did manage to get to create a coherent policy for the government around China, whereas before we were in effect running contradictory ones. Contest, the counter-terrorism strategy was one. Universal credit, obviously not a national security one, I think was another area. We were just starting to tackle the whole question around social care and trying to take a similar kind of approach as we were hit by the pandemic, and inevitably that was then crowded out.
What were the things that these examples that you cite we can learn from? What are the things that make strategic thinking in government successful?
I think you need, as you've already heard, longevity in personnel. So whether it's ministers or civil servants, if everyone moves around too fast, there's always a tendency to reset the clock, to have a sort of year zero. Everything that went before was nothing to do with me, and now I'm going to have my own program. And there's a huge pressure, partly because of the kind of grid phenomenon that George Robertson just mentioned, for ministers to announce things and have initiatives and so on. And those inevitably aren't particularly strategic. They tend to be quite short term, and they aren't always properly aligned with other existing policy agenda. And so I think, of course, one can't sort of take the politics out of government. That would be naive to suggest that. But I think in these areas, if a government focused on a handful of really big cross-cutting issues and said, okay, those we're going to apply the full toolkit to, the Prime Minister personally behind them, setting up the right governance mechanisms at ministerial level with top officials on the hook for delivering those and expected to see a programme through. I mean, if at least to a natural inflection point, if not all the way through to a conclusion, if it's a decade-long programme, but certainly to a natural inflection point, then I think you would see a better delivery.
I think prime ministers can be encouraged to insist on longevity of their ministers. It doesn't really work like that.
Well, it doesn't. And in the end, that's up to them. But if they want to have a government that actually delivers big things, then they'd be well advised to put ministers in place, train them properly, as you've already heard, and leave them there for as long as they can. Sometimes politics means they can't, but generally, we rotate ministers in this country much faster than they do elsewhere. We have more ministers. We have a cabinet that's roughly twice the size of the US cabinet. So we have more of them. We rotate them faster. They don't have expertise in their areas necessarily. It's quite rare for them to do so. To build that expertise up takes time. And if you're just moving people around all the time, not only do they not have the capacity to do any real strategic planning and thinking, they have none of the incentives to, because they know they're likely to be moved on, and therefore they're inevitably going to be focused on the short term.
Some of that applies to the civil service as well, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And so, no, as I said, I'll give you an example from my time at the Home Office, which was not particularly about people moving around too fast. It was just about the point about incentives. We would have an immigration bill just about every year. Liam Byrne will remember that from his time as well. But you would have a bill team, and then you'd have the bill would be done. People would have made concessions to deal with whatever pressures were coming from the Commons or the Lords, and then it would go to a different group to implement it. And that different group would often have people in who had the real operational expertise in the immigration system, and they would say, well, actually, clause X and clause Y can't both be done. They're incompatible. So one of the changes I made was to say, right, the bill team, of course you have people who are good at the parliamentary handling, but we will actually treat this like a programme, and the person in charge of the legislation is going to be in charge of the implementation, and they're going to see at least the initial phases of the implementation through in order to try to get align the incentives, if you like, from the people developing the legislation into its delivery. And things like that, some quite simple changes could be made that would, I think, actually improve the coherence of some of the work the government does.
Ian Stewart.
Thank you. I'd like to dig a little further into your comments about the role of the centre of government, number 10 in the Cabinet Office, in overseeing these important strategic cross-cutting issues. What's the right balance between those offices being a directing activity in other departments, and to what extent are they more of a guiding mind, a sort of more of a laissez-faire, letting the departments come up with the product at the end? What's the balance between those two?
I don't think we've always got that right, and I think sometimes, even in the national security area, I think when I tried to develop this concept, I probably tried to do it in too many places at once, and inevitably, therefore, bandwidth, which is part of the question, part of the point you're driving at, Mr. Stewart, I think became a constraint. I think if the centre, if there are a handful, whether it's national security or broader government policies, of big strategic issues that the Prime Minister personally cares about, that require several departments to be involved just because of the nature of the issue, then the centre needs to take quite a directive approach, because otherwise departments tend to favour the things that they're in charge of rather than the things that they are a member of a team for that someone else is in charge of. And so only really the centre can drive departments to do that and use the Prime Minister's authority to drive departments to do that. But if you try to do that on too many things, and I think I might have fallen into that trap in constructing some of these mechanisms, then that effort just becomes dissipated. So I think the role of the centre is to drive and lead on those things that are really big cross-cutting priorities where there's no natural departmental home for them. It should be much lighter touch, obviously with stock takes and reviews of performance and all of that kind of thing, but it should be much lighter touch, much more hands-off, more a sort of assurance function for the vast majority of policy areas which should sit in the departments. And as I say, I'm not sure when I was at the centre I got that balance right, and I think that's something that is well worth reflecting further on.
Liam Byrne.
Thanks very much indeed, Jim. Mark, just two questions really. If you think back about ends, ways and means, when you look across the landscape of some of the things you're involved in number 10, do you think that the centre was better at any one of those three dimensions than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ends, ways and means are essentially goals, plans and then programmes of activity. And the centre is much better at goals. In fact, government is generally much better at goals. And what we tried to do with the new sort of fusion approach we took in the capability review was actually you need a structure that essentially connects all of that. So you start with goals, ministerial decision. You then need to be really clear and get expert advice on what the situation, the genuine situation and outlook are, not happy talk or fantasy thinking about actually the situation. What is the situation? What is the outlook? What are the scenarios that might play out? Your target scenario, your reasonable worst case, your minimum acceptable. Then you need to think about what is a comprehensive plan, because government is only ever one actor. Certainly the UK is only ever one actor internationally, but even domestically, government's only one actor in this. We tend to ask ourselves, what is government going to do about it? Well, actually, what is government going to catalyse the rest of society to do about it would be a much more intelligent way of thinking about it. Then ask what is government's catalytic set of interventions, given all of those other actors. And then finally, what resources do you need to apply? And the question that we don't ask enough, we did in the national security area, what is the ministerial risk appetite? Because if the risk appetite and the resources are not commensurate with the goals, you're setting yourself up for failure. And hope or fantasy delivery can't be the balancing item. There needs to be a discipline which says if we're only able to apply these resources and to this question, then we either have to increase our risk appetite or we have to reduce our goals if the resources are limited. But you have to align those things. And I think it's that kind of discipline, which is essentially an ends, ways and means discipline, but it's thinking of it in a slightly more political and broader governmental way, because risk appetite is rarely explicit, and it should be. And certainly resources and the alignment between resources and goals needs to be explicit.
That sort of takes us to the Treasury, and you were somebody who came up through a national security background rather than a Treasury background into the role that you played with great distinction in number 10. I mean, how would you characterise style of Treasury input into that means piece of the equation? And how does it improve in the future?
I think actually, if set out in those terms, I didn't find the Treasury to be the obstacle that some others have described, because what the Treasury really dislikes is highly ambitious goals for which there isn't really proper funding, and then, of course, pressure to find more money to achieve the goals. Of course, they would also want to add in a whole load of questions around delivery confidence. If you can't just throw more money at something because it may well get wasted, so you've got to think about all of those things. The effectiveness in terms of delivery, they would want those things as well. But I must admit, when I was dealing with this, I didn't find a conversation, at least at the conceptual level, with the Treasury, which said, are the goals aligned with the resources we're applying, and let's be explicit about the risk appetite. They're quite comfortable with that kind of language, because it has a sort of concreteness to it that appeals to the sort of Treasury culture.
So if you take that kind of to and fro that you have to have between ends, means and goals, I mean, did you find Treasury input into helping goal setting and ways setting quite useful? Or was it not there? Or did it vary?
It varied really on whether they felt they had a Treasury interest in it. I think where my kind of approach really ran up against Treasury institutional resistance was, are you going to, if you think of these big cross-cutting priorities that we've been discussing, would you apply a single budget to that? And would you give someone control of that budget rather than the budgets all being continue to be held essentially in bilateral negotiations between the Treasury and the departments? They were never keen to hand a budget for significant national security elements to someone else, because the Treasury's approach to spending is, as you know, I think everyone around the table has dealt with it in one way or another, is very bilateral. Yeah. And so that is challenging, because they always want to know where the money's going to come from, and it's a zero-sum game for them. And so I do think there are some questions around whether it is possible to apply budgets, essentially cross-cutting budgets, horizontal budgets rather than vertical budgets, if you like, to some of these really big questions. Gordon Brown tried it with his cross-cutting PSAs, public service agreement targets, but even that in the end came back to the siloization of departments, and even he couldn't really land that component of it.
If we agree that there's virtue in creating stronger integrating forces between departments to deliver on a particular task, and it's hard to deliver pooled budgets in order to enable it, then the role of number 10 as the force for integration becomes really important. And Tony Blair had a particular way of doing that, which was Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. And actually the Prime Minister Delivery Unit stock takes were quite good in getting the right people around the table. It took Gordon Brown some time to figure out a model that connected the connected energy between number 10 and departments, but Domestic Policy Council, the Proto-National Security Council, Political Renewal Council, that was his preferred model, and that was informed by the National Economic Council. Do we not have to accept that different prime ministers have different characters, and therefore they're always going to have different models for how to drive that integration and to drive that delivery? Do we not just have to accept that it's going to take a bit of time to figure out a gearbox that works for a particular style of prime minister?
Yeah, absolutely right. But I think if you look at those examples, and indeed the examples in for example, David Cameron's government as well, obviously subsequent to that, I mean, Brexit and other crises tended to crowd out that more sort of considered approach. But if you look at all of them, the reason they came up with those different ways of approaching it was because they were dissatisfied with the gearing mechanisms that they inherited. And so I think actually the value of this kind of conversation is, I don't think they said, I want gearing mechanism A or gearing mechanism B because that works for me. I think they just felt that the gearing mechanisms didn't work and they wanted to try something different. I think if we actually had a better gearbox, that the professionals, people in my job, and others, people like you in this committee, were able to develop. I don't think a prime minister would change that just because they say it doesn't work for my particular personality. I think they'd be pleased that the delivery mechanisms, the gearing mechanism between strategy and delivery was there. Of course, then you've got to reflect the way the prime minister wants to do it. But the fundamental mechanisms, a cabinet committee to deal with, let's say a prime minister says, right, I really want to crack growth and productivity. It's going to be, I want the following 6 departments are going to be the ones who are really on this. There's going to be a cabinet committee on it. I'm going to chair it every week. Like I chair the National Security Council, there's going to be a delivery mechanism behind it. You put in the right civil service machine, you ensure that budgets are allocated according to that, etc., etc. Different prime ministers will chair that in very different ways, but I think they'd be perfectly happy if that mechanism actually turned their intent into policy delivery.
What incentives could be put in place to encourage individual civil servants to invest their careers in cross-departmental working?
I think actually when I tried this, civil servants loved doing it. I put teams together just as sort of pilots and said, just work across department. They actually really enjoy it because, I mean, frankly, civil servants are mostly team players. If you aren't, you choose a different kind of career because it's such a big and complex organization. And they like the idea of working together and having some agency on a collective problem, because so many, you've talked to a lot of civil servants, Bernard, over the years. You know, often the frustrations are, I really know what needs to be done, but the levers exist somewhere else, and I can't find a way of helping to pull them. So I think actually create the right structures, and civil servants will mostly work really well within them. Then, of course, what you have to do, and we did this with the SROs that we appointed in the national security area, you then have to say your cross-government responsibilities are a big part of your job. Your annual performance reviews and all the rest of it will also depend, as well as performing on your kind of normal responsibilities, if you like, as important, or maybe even in some cases more important, will be your responsibilities as a cross-government SRO. And that was immature, but actually was beginning to bite a bit in my case. If I think of Philip Barton, now Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office, part of the way that his profile within Whitehall rose was because he was a very effective cross-government SRO on the government's Russia strategy as a Director General in the Foreign Office. And that kind of example is one that we should be pursuing.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you. So that persistence of SRO responsibility, both within and across government, we've seen just in the recent defence acquisition reform announcement last week. The Defence Procurement Minister said that they are looking at extending SRO tenure from the 2 terms, which I introduced when I had that role, into senior roles, to potentially 3 terms, to allow them to take responsibility and hold it through changes in ministerial appointment. That's something I presume you would support. Did you think of doing that? Did that happen under your watch?
Not in terms of fixed terms. What we did try to do was leave people in jobs for longer. But to be honest, I didn't achieve very much. I didn't achieve as much on that as I would have wanted. And I think one of the issues there, I mean, you can sometimes do it at the most senior levels just because, frankly, there are fewer places for people to go, and therefore the churn can slow down a bit. But what you have to do is then create the right career incentives for people to stay in a job. Because if they're going to get better pay, promotion, more recognition, broader experience, better chance at big jobs elsewhere by moving around, then the strong incentive for the really good people is to move around. And so what we have to try to do is create as strong a set of incentives for someone to see something through, and then not find when they come up to a promotion board, someone will say, well, they're just a bit of a one-trick pony. They did a great job on that, but they don't have the breadth we need for a job at the next level up. And there's just a tension in that. There is just a tension in that. And I think we need to resolve that tension if we're going to encourage the really good people to stick at things for a long period. I remember being told by a very senior permanent secretary of my own career, he said, look, you need to stick at some things for a while, and then you can be a bit of a dilettante. You can move around quickly again, but then you need to stick at something else for a while. And I think that's right.
How do we encourage those incentives for strategic thinking amongst senior civil servants?
I mean, first, as you discussed with other witnesses, you need to teach it to people. People don't really, not many people really understand what strategic thinking, what good strategy looks like. And as I said, the language is sometimes misused to mean big or senior. Or this is a strategic question. Well, actually, it isn't. It's just a really big and complex one. Or we're going to operate with this at the strategic level. No, we're going to operate this at a very senior level. And so I think it needs to be trained. And then people need to go back to the exchange I was having with Liam Byrne. You need people to see things through from formulation of strategy with ministers, right the way through to the strategic programme, its reviews, etc. And the agreement be that you will be responsible for that as an SRO or programme director or whatever, a policy programme director, just as we have people who are procurement programme directors, until there's at least a natural inflection point, a natural big milestone at which then it makes sense, you know, for someone else to take up the baton.
How do we encourage ministers and potential ministers that it's in their interest to develop strategic thinking skills?
Tell them they'll be in jobs for longer. I mean, I would also help teach it to them. As you heard from George Robertson, we don't really teach ministers about government or potential ministers about government. They're expected to sort of sink or swim and apply a set of skills that are, you know, political skills are critically important in a minister, but they aren't the only skills that a really effective minister needs. They also need governance skills, and those two things don't arise naturally. You have to teach them, and we don't really train ministers at all. But to be frank, if you really want them to be strategic, you've got to give them time to be strategic.
So on teaching, you when you appeared before us in private, you referred to re-establishing a school, and Lord Robertson was saying the same thing earlier. We've moved away from a physical campus to online learning, and much of it up to the individual whether they apply or not, because they have to pay for it. So do you support what he was saying about getting back to a dedicated school of government and a physical one?
Yes. Yes, I think you need a physical campus, and I think particularly if we're going to put ministers, potential ministers, rising stars in the civil service, rising stars in Parliament, local government leaders, both political and official, together, then actually the network effect you get from those people just actually being in the same room, having coffee, getting to know each other, is really beneficial, because you then understand the different tensions and cultures. And quite often in conversations like this, you have ministers complaining that civil servants aren't political enough, and civil servants complaining that ministers are too political, and sort of vice versa. People have got to understand each other's imperatives and cultures, and you can't do that online. I mean, there's a role for online, of course there is, but fundamentally, it's better that people have the chance to do this kind of thing. Particularly, strategic thinking is largely a creative process. The creative process works best if it's in a sort of organic environment in which people can kick ideas around, and you have to do that in person, in my view.
Thank you. And final question: are there any other things that you'd like to bring to our attention that you think needs to be done to change the culture of the civil service to make it more strategic?
I think we've touched on the main ones: longevity, prizing strategic thinking, really making sure though that people understand that it is about delivery of policy. I think those are some of the key elements of it. But some of these things do require structural reform. It isn't just about individual civil servants and the culture and so on. It does require structural reform as well, and I don't think we should duck that.
So just on structural reform, and we've touched on the net zero Britain ambition and going into legislation as one of the examples where a strategic approach was taken to a major issue. And the implementation of or arriving at the nationally determined contribution ahead of COP26 was as a result of a structural change to government to require a cabinet subcommittee and then an implementation committee of senior civil servants to come up with a number. I can't remember whether you were in post when that was put together, but as soon as we'd finished COP26, the structure of government was changed so that that committee structure disappeared, which would appear to be hard then to create the same level of impetus across government departments to deliver something which is now a national ambition. Was that a mistake, do you think? Would you go back to that kind of structure?
Yes, I mean, this is the point that I think we've all really been wrestling with. That if something is a really big, long-term strategic question, which in that case is inevitably going to involve governments of different political complexions, just because of the longevity of the goal, then creating machinery that is responsive, of course, to changes of government and different political priorities as they arise, but essentially has the same machinery that new ministers, long-term ministers can be confident will deliver, create that gearing mechanism that Liam Byrne and I were talking about. I think those things should be retained, and it makes sense to do so. I think, for example, one of the things I was wrestling with when I was Cabinet Secretary was, could I bring together the net zero community with the climate change adaptation community? Those who are having to think about what we do, given that at least some of the effects of climate change are locked in, essentially, no matter whether we hit 1.5, 2, 2.5, whatever. Because the impact on the industries and sectors impacted are the same. It's transport, infrastructure, land use, etc. And it was very hard to do that, partly because the two communities had such different preoccupations. But just trying to get them together to do common presentations to the wider civil service and so on, I put a lot of effort to do. Eventually, we managed to get them to do that. And personally, I would want to create a common structure that looked at both sides of that coin. And again, one that endured between different governments. That allows ministers to come in and turn the dial up or down, move the graphic equaliser, if you like, according to their immediate priorities. But you don't have to redesign the graphic equaliser every time to allow ministers the flexibility to make some judgments about where they want to, what they want to prioritise and where the trade-offs are.
Thank you. So in our search of the world for the best strategic mechanisms, we came across the Finnish idea of a report on the future made annually to Parliament. Do you think something like that could help focus minds in government and present something that was holistic, useful, forward-looking? Would that be a good mechanism for us to adopt here?
Yeah, I think that is a good idea. The other one I looked at was the New Zealand model of essentially a national performance framework, and something has been tried along those lines by the devolved administration, so obviously in a more constrained way, where in essentially we can measure the economy. It's always argued about, but we can measure the economy. But actually having a national performance framework that is measuring a whole range of outcomes. On which there is loads of data, you'd need some independence around it. I think would also, with an annual report to Parliament that's looking at trends, etc., combine that with the sort of thing you're talking about, which is sort of more future focused, I think would be well worth doing. And then all governments are of whatever political complexion worry about inflation, worry about unemployment, and those statistics are pretty clear. They should be thinking about. Wouldn't it be a good idea if we had equally objective data sets that looked at the whole range of government activity? And then again, governments make their choices, and Parliament decides what it's preoccupied with. But at least we'd know how we were doing and where we stood in the league tables and so on.
And there's obviously a galaxy of brilliant minds on select committees like this one. Do you think there is a way in which we can conquer some of the adversarial culture and character of select committee departmental engagement? Is there a way for us to create and guard a space where we can actually have a more constructive dialogue? And would that be a useful thing for the civil service and for ministers?
Yes, I mean, I think it's the short answer, but I guess having been on the receiving end of quite a lot of fairly punchy select committees in my time, you might expect me to say, a more inquisitorial, less adversarial approach would be good. Look, there's clearly a role for the tough and adversarial lines of questioning, and actually it does. Just to reassure you as senior select committee members, it does impose a significant pressure onto civil service and ministers, because you think you've got one coming up at some point, and you need to be able to address those concerns. But I do think being able to flex more between the inquisitorial and the adversarial would be helpful. Sometimes there's a benefit in private sessions, but I don't think one should overdo that, because I think if it's inquisitorial in private and then adversarial in public, then it becomes too much of a game, really. And actually, I think that turns that turns people off governance and politics, because they just feel that actually it's all just theatre. So I think some of this is down to building essentially a set of relationships where you know that there are going to be times you're going to get a really hard time, but there are going to be other times, most of the time, it's going to be a more inquisitorial process. And I think some of this sits with select committees. That there's some of the knockabout stuff one gets of a senior civil servant being asked how much they get paid, before someone then asks them a question about how they're completely useless. That you can see why that's a parliamentarian trying to get something onto their own social media account and into the newspapers. That is inevitably just going to create a very defensive set of reactions. So there's something here, I think, for select committee chairs, probably collectively, to think about. Actually, there are certain things we're just not going to permit, and we're going to try and raise the focus onto issues of substance, and be perhaps harder on some of our colleagues who are looking for their next social media post.
Last one from me, Chair, is just about how we structure some input more systematically from young people. So, I visit a primary school every fortnight. I'm always incredibly impressed by the youth councils and eco councils that I meet. Last year I ran a Generation Earthshot competition with 16 schools and was just completely taken aback by the quality of input from, some quite small children in the most income-deprived constituency in the country. I mean, do you think there is a virtue, and is there a method by which we could potentially improve input from young people in some of this longer wave policy thinking?
Yes, I think not least because actually they're craving it. They think this is what politics and government is or should be about. The really big things, most young people very focused on climate change, but also focused on some other really big questions, demographics, other environmental issues, geopolitics and so on. I do now probably more than I used to, quite a lot of engagement with schools and groups. I did a podcast with at a local school the other day. One of the things that a bunch of sixth formers, and one of the things that really struck me, is it not strike you, is you get questions. The filter is just off. It's not. It's even with the sort of tougher interviews on the Today programme or even in select committees, there's a sort of understanding. Everyone understands the kind of rules of the game. But when you're dealing with young people, there are no rules of the game. They just want you to answer the question they've put to you, and there is no filter to it. And I find that challenging, but really energizing. And so I think it would be good for getting young people more engaged in politics. We know that youth engagement, at least, people are highly engaged in issues, but not engaged in informal politics. Voting rates and all the rest of it are really poor. I think if we could create something, I don't have an easy answer to it, that really engaged young people somehow in it, and they could see other young people being engaged and being taken seriously, and holding a cabinet secretary to account and asking them questions. Maybe that would be a contribution to engaging younger people more with the formal political system, rather than resting on sort of campaigns and other issues alone. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it would be good if they were more engaged with the formal political system as well. Could you have a youth version of some of these committees? And how? I mean, of course, there are lots of complications about who you choose and how you do it and all the rest of it. But could you do that? Could you have? If you have a hearing coming up, are there youth groups you could ask? Well, what questions would you like to be asked? I don't know. This is your business, probably better than mine. But I think it's well worth the effort.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lord Sedwill. It's been an excellent session, and you've given us plenty to think about. I'm very grateful that you managed to fit us into your schedule. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As I say, sorry I couldn't be there in person today, but thank you for the session. Thank you for the question.
Order.
Good.
Portcullis House. The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.